Jim Rigano, R-I-G-A-N-O. I'm a current Springboro City Community City Schools Board of Education member, serving a term that started in January of 2012 and served a previous term from 2002 to 2005. So this is my second stint on the board. Ran alongside a colleague, David Petroni. We were both elected in January. We ran on a fiscally conservative platform. And the backstory on that, I guess, is really perhaps something that you need to understand as to why we were elected and what our positions are. Our school district had put up repeatedly school levies, and they were failing. And the school board asked the former board members to come in and talk to them. Wanted to understand. They were looking. They said they were looking for feedback. They were really not looking for feedback. They're looking for an endorsement. But they gave us the reasons why they were putting the levy on the ballot, and it included some things that, even in my first term, I didn't like. Things that a community could interpret as threats. You know, do you do this, or we're going to cut sports, or we're going to institute a high pay-to-play fee, or we're going to have to cut busing, and you know, the kind of things that you typically hear. I voiced some objections at that time. Didn't matter, the levy went on the ballot anyway. It turns out it failed. They kept it off the ballot for a while. It came back, and in fact, Kelly Coles was elected to the board. Mr. Scott Anderson was elected alongside her. They were both newcomers, and incumbents were replaced. It was clear that the community wanted to see a change on the board, and at that time, shortly after Kelly was elected, I met her, and she had presented to me the 5-year forecast, which is the key document for all school districts' finances. So you have to understand that financial forecast in order to really understand school districts' finances, and most important are the assumptions behind there. But Kelly had looked at the forecast and just looked at the increase in expenses, and the overall expenses were increasing at about 7% a year. Well, this was in so December 2009 or so. She had talked to me about this, and the expenses were going up at 7% a year. Inflation is not much at the time. I mean, it was flat or 1%, and our student enrollment wasn't really changing. So why were these expenses going up 7% a year? Well, she got me thinking about it. I started digging into that because I had some experience because of my prior term with those school finances and financial forecasts. I looked into that, and it was clear that the lines that were driving that were the personnel costs, payroll costs, and the benefits costs. Those were what were driving most of those expenses. And so that got me interested, and I started looking into why, and that led me to the forecast assumptions. And it's built. The assumptions are built around assuming that everything is going to continue the way it was. Well, the economy was not in good shape, but the school district's just assuming that everything is just continuing the way it would. No change in what we're doing, and so. Yeah, our financial forecast had assumed that we were going to have a base salary increase, which means that whole salary schedule is going to move up. I think they had 1.5%. I forget exactly what it was, but it's like 1.5%. And of course, all of their steps continue also, which adds another 4% or so to that. So we had 5.25% raises built into the financial forecast at a time when everybody else in private sector, foreclosures were up. People were losing their job, unemployment was up. It was that kind of situation, and they're just budgeting like nothing ever changed. And so I started making presentations to the board and on those issues. I guess the other thing about that forecast that when I looked at that, we realized that our school district at the time was paying 90% of the health insurance premium. And of course, personally, we pay 50% of our premium. My wife and I and her employer pays the other 50%. But I think in general, most employers, at least in private business, are requiring employees to make a much bigger contribution. And so, those were big factors. At any rate, to fast forward a little bit, I'd started making presentations to the board and continued to do that from, I think, Kelly's first board meeting. I made my first presentation on this topic, and I continued to do that. The district really wasn't paying attention. They renewed an insurance with an extremely generous plan. They put the levy back on, I think it was June of that summer, in spite of me suggesting that they needed to temper what they were putting in there. That didn't happen, and really I was put in, almost forced into position, because the lobbying up front didn't work, was forced into position to actually come out and campaign against putting this levy on the ballot. Which was kind of a difficult and awkward position, because nobody likes to be put in a position of campaigning against the school district. But met David Petroni around that time, and we looked at it, and it was just the right thing to do, because the people who are serving the community can't pretend that the community isn't suffering when the economy had turned and things had gotten bad. It just wasn't right. And we felt we needed to point out to the community what the situation was. Mm-hmm. And we actively campaigned against the levy, and it failed again. And that action forced the school district to take a second look at this financial forecast and the assumptions that they had built into it. I think it was, the next forecasting period would have been May of 2011, I guess, is something on that order. I think it was May 2011. And when they did that forecast and they fixed these assumptions and put more realistic assumptions in, the $25 million deficit they were projecting and telling themselves that they had, that deficit disappeared, and now they were forecasting a $6 million surplus. And the only thing that happened was they changed these assumptions that were in the forecast and rebuilt a more credible forecast. That's not, I shouldn't say the only thing. I mean, they did some other things. We had a retirement incentive program to help retire people that had been around a long time and had big salaries, and we replaced them with people with small salaries. That was a factor in helping that budget. And there were a number of other things that were done, but they did take a much more a harder look at what those salary and benefit assumptions should be, and that helped a lot. As we were campaigning against that levy, what we did is we offered an alternative budget. We didn't just say vote against this. We offered examples of what if we didn't have a base salary increase? What would that do to the forecast over 5 years? Turns out in our school district that was a couple $1 million, and we're a lot smaller than Westerville, by the way. We have one high school. I think you guys have 3. What if that base salary increase didn't happen? What if we didn't have those step increases? For our district, it was about 4% for each employee that got the increase. And we computed the dollars that would save and what that would do to the deficit. And so we put together a plan, and I went to the board podium and presented this plan to the school board that said, if you do this, if you freeze base salary, this is the effect that it would have on your five-year forecast, and it was a couple $1 million. If you freeze the steps, this is the effect that it would have on your 5-year forecast. If you change the insurance contribution, instead of the district paying 90%, if we paid 70%, or 60%, I think was the number I actually used at the time, this would be the effect. And we're talking millions of dollars of effect over that 5-year forecast. And they were forecasting at the time that $25 million deficit. Well, if they had implemented all of the things that I pointed out, some of it was, some administrative things within the school district. We had, we have some large elementary schools. We could consolidate principals. At the time, we had the opportunity to rebid our insurance program, go with the healthcare consortium, and we had actually had a proposal in hand that they rejected that previous March, or just didn't pursue it. And that was one of the things we identified they could do. But we had I had 12 steps, as it turns out, of things that they could do to save money. And it tallied over $30 million if they were to implement all of those the way that we were estimating that they could be. And so at the end of the day, the next time they forecast after that levy failed, they looked at some of these things. They did some of them. They did some of their own things. And that $25 million deficit they were projecting, turns out it was a $6 million surplus when they got done. No levy, no change, and then what the board started to do is they said, well, these things that we've been brainwashing ourselves thinking that we're poor, so we let class sizes go up. We had some elementary class sizes that were 30 plus kids. Board said, well, let's put some people back in the classroom. We don't need to cut busing anymore. We had at one point our district had restricted the busing to the outside the 2-mile radius within the school district, and they said, well, we don't need to do that anymore. Let's put that back in. So all these services are coming back in just because they fixed the assumptions in the budget to reflect reality. And so that's the key, is to understand what your school district is including in its assumptions. And a lot of these assumptions, they end up having a big impact because they're projected out over 5 years. Yeah. And so you need to kind of look at that big broad picture, because the school district is looking out probably at least 3 years and saying, okay, we have to do levy plans and that kind of stuff, based on where we think we're going to be in 3 years. So if I was to advise people who are interested in how to control school costs, it's a matter of digging into that 5-year forecast. And the districts are required to publish information to the Ohio Department of Education, so those forecasts are on the website. The Ohio Department of Education website. Most school districts post it on their own website. They also publish assumptions with it. Now, I've found that those assumptions usually aren't sufficient and detailed enough, so you have to go ask the questions. And our school district, we would publish assumptions about base increase, and because we were failing levies, they would not increase the base salaries, but the steps just kept going on. Well, that assumption was just not published. And yes, being a former board member, I was aware that those things happened, so I went and I had to ask them, how much have you put in here for those step and classification increases? And so I got that information, but that's I guess leads us to the point where David and I, over this, it had been about a year ago, we were sitting there saying, we've been pretty effective by doing the lobbying that we did. We convinced the school district that they needed to get these assumptions in line, and so the question was really for us is, could we do anything more by being on the board? Of course, by being a public official, you get into restrictions on how you can communicate with your other elected officials, and it gets more complicated. Ultimately, we decided that we should run for the board. We ran on the platform that we're going to continue to look for alternatives to levies, that we're going to do our darndest to understand this budget to a level that deeper than we could from off the board, and to make sure that the community can be confident that we have a good solid budget. Now in our case, we had the $25 million deficit, turns into a $6 million surplus. We didn't add any money to the equation. What happened? So we felt that the community needed to understand, or at least have a lot of credibility into, they needed to know that we had a good budget. And so, David and I, our board formed a policy, a budget and finance committee, and David and I serve on that budget finance committee together, and we instituted a zero-based budgeting policy, which meant you don't just rely on last year's number and increase it by 3%. We start at ground zero in the budget, and you have to justify everything that's in your budget. And so we instituted that budget process this year, and I'm comfortable telling the community today that we do have a good solid budget. That $6 million surplus has grown to a $14 million surplus, and we're now looking at things that we didn't look at before. The board never considered bus replacements before. They didn't consider setting aside money for capital improvements because in their mindset they were poor. Well, now that we have a good handle on these finances, we're looking, and this $14 million surplus is actually going to be reduced as we allocate money for buses and we allocate money for capital improvements and do the things that we need to do to make sure that we take care of the facilities that the public's provided to us. Well, I think that the devastation happens when people don't have confidence in their elected officials. And when we had that $25 million deficit and it disappears, what's the community to think? And I think that there isn't much doubt that David and I were elected because of that issue. And the people want to know that their elected officials are representing them. And I think that's one of the problems, misunderstandings among a lot of school board members. In fact, we're not members of the OSBA, and one of the reasons is I don't think that the OSBA teaches school board members to be community representatives. I think they teach them to be school district flag carriers and not community representatives. So people need to know that their interests are being represented. That's really the purpose of a school board, is to represent the community interest. And when school board members do that, I believe that it builds confidence. Now, we're not destroying Springboro. Springboro's as strong as it's ever been. And in fact, I think it's stronger because four of those failed levies happened before we were ever involved. There was already an erosion of confidence in Springboro in the school district. We did help the community become aware of what's going on, and I think they kind of knew what was going on anyway, but we brought some light to it, and now they should have confidence in what we're doing. And so, I think at the end of the day, that a school district can't really function well unless they have the confidence of the community. And for us, I think we've brought that here. That's what we've brought. Our staff should feel more comfortable because now they understand that we understand the finances and that we're not in a deficit situation, we're in a surplus situation. And so I don't see where anything's been hurt in Springboro. We do get a little bit of publicity from now and then, but I think it's the school establishment trying to keep the school establishment the way it's always been, and not react to changes that are happening in our communities.
Excellent.
Our board rarely disagrees, and on the issue of financial stewardship, we have a 5-0 board. Every board member, we've adopted the policy that we're going to try to maintain a balanced budget every year. In other words, the taxpayers have agreed to give us a certain amount of money. In our case, it's $43 million that they provide for us to operate the school district. And we believe it's our responsibility to operate within the amount of money that they've authorized, and not more. I mean, if we go out here and we create a budget that spends more than they've authorized, we're exceeding our authority, and in my opinion, not acting responsibly. Now, there may come a time where we'll sacrifice services. I think by our current budget, that's several years down. That's at least 6 years down the road, because we're 5 years down the road. We have a $14 million surplus, so it's more than 6 years down the road. But if we spend more than the community has authorized, I think that's a breach of fiduciary responsibility. And unfortunately, most school districts do that. And you look at school district financial forecasts, and they just continually spend more money than they have. And then what do they have to do? They have to put another levy on the ballot. So our entire board has adopted this philosophy of not spending more than the community has given us to operate. Let me just go here. As David Petroni and I were actively campaigning against our 5th school levy attempt, we were assaulted by members of the school community. Verbally assaulted, and accused of, we don't like kids, we don't like schools, the whole 9 yards. You just don't want to pay more money. Well, what we want is the money to go for kids. And to counter that, we devised what we called a Children First budget. And the Children First budget is built around the premise that when you develop your budget, the first things that funds should be allocated for are the things that are helping kids. I mean, that's your teacher's current salary. It's the books. It's all these things. And in our school district, what they were telling us is that class sizes are unavoidably high, that we had to cut busing, that we can't buy textbooks. Now, those were the reasons that they cited for needing this levy. Well, when we looked at the budget, what was in that levy were the 4+% raises, or 5+% raises that were in the budget, the 90-10 allocation on who pays, school district paying 90% of the health insurance premium. Those things were in the budget, but they were leaving out textbooks, additional teachers to lower class sizes, those things. We asked the question, well, if kids are your first priority, why aren't you budgeting for textbooks and lower class sizes? Why are you putting your raises? I mean, that was the one thing that they wouldn't touch is the raises. So as they developed this budget, we just asked the question, are you really putting kids first? Because it doesn't look like you're doing that when you budget. And so that ultimately led the school district, I believe, to reconsider the busing. And we reinstated our high school busing, and we had money budgeted for textbooks. All these things that they said they couldn't do, they ended up being able to do once they got the budget fixed. So our position is if you're really putting kids first, then a Children's First budget allocates enough. It allocates the resources you need to keep class sizes where they need to be. It buys the materials and the supplies that you need to run the educational system. It can then look at support things like maintenance of the buildings and the administrative staff that needs to be there. Then you can look at extracurricular activities and sports, because those benefit kids too. And then the last thing, the one thing that really doesn't have a direct benefit to kids is the amount of money that you pay in raises and that you pay for health insurance benefits. And when you look at it from that type of a bottom-up approach, the entire budget changes. And that's what we call the Children First budget. I'm Jim Rigano, R-I-G-A-N-O. I'm a school board member at Springboro Community City Schools.